Welcome everyone. I'm wondering, Joao, our head of arts EU Europe, maybe would like to say a quick hello to our fellows.
Thanks, Ludo. Yeah, we're not very hierarchical like that, but yeah, I'll keep it brief. This is really not my show, but thanks, Ludo. I'll take the segue. Yeah, I'm Joao. I'm Director of Arts for the British Council of Europe. So it's just really a pleasure to be here. It's been fantastic working with Jerwood colleagues and Nadine, and of course my own colleagues in getting us this far. We're so excited that so many of you have shown an interest in our offer, and what a way to start these conversations to focus on Spain. I think today more so than ever, we're just talking about this in the preamble, and thank you, Gio, for that. I'll steal that for now. The need for us to continue to connect across borders, and that's what we're doing. I think day to day, that's what I sort of wake up every day to do, and just to enable those connections. So wonderful. That's enough for me. I think, yeah, Ludo will have lots to say, and yeah, we're just here for you. So yeah, looking forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao. So welcome everyone to Spain, actually, and even if it's virtually, I would have loved to have a fantastic background of Barcelona, Madrid, or Sevilla, for example, but actually we are in the office. I'm here with my colleague Cristina Ward. We'll be in charge of presenting you during 30 minutes, more or less 25 minutes, an overview of the cultural life in Spain for the last 15 years. And we have the special honor to have Giorgia Loretti with us to talk about more in details about gender equality, diversity in the music sector, music industry, as she has a fantastic track record in this sector. I'll share with you our presentation. I hope you will enjoy it, and I'll hand over to my colleague Cristina for this first overall context. Let me know if you can see the presentation. I think it's fine. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Up to you.
Thank you. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. So we thought we'd start off with a general overview of Spain before going into the arts and culture scene more specifically. So here's a bird's eye view of the country. It's actually the largest country in Southern Europe and the second largest country in Western Europe. And as you can see, it's got a population of 47,450,000 people. For those of you who don't know the country or don't know it very well, it's actually very different. It changes a lot from north to south. So the north looks often more like Switzerland or Austria, which is a very sort of green mountainous region. And the south, as you probably know, is where the beaches are, and places like Benidorm or Torremolinos. So it's a very varied country. It's the capital of Spain, as I'm sure you all know, is Madrid, and the major cities are Barcelona, Valencia, Sevilla, Malaga, Bilbao, Palma de Mallorca in the Balearic Islands, and of course the Canary Islands as well. One of the interesting things about Spain, or things that makes it's interesting to know, is that 81% of the population actually lives in cities. So it's a very urban country. This is something that's happened over the past few years, and it's now actually become quite a big issue. The fact that the rural Spain is becoming emptied in favor of the cities. So if you like, let's go, well, before we go on to the next slide, as you can see, Spain is made up of 17 autonomous regions. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, and 2 autonomous cities. And it's basically 57% Christian country with basically Catholic faith. But I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. So if we go on to the next slide. The first part of what I'm going to talk about now, the next thing I'm going to talk about now, is a small potted history of the country, which I do think is actually important to understand the way the country is today. So as probably you probably know, Spain suffered an incredibly difficult civil war in the 1930s, and this led to a military government that was in place into the 1970s. This was incredibly important for the history, for the country's history as from that time, in the sense that obviously those 40 years of military dictatorship meant that the country, at a time when other countries in Europe were really, pacing forward, meant that the country was very stagnated at that time. Economically, it was very insular. Communications were very difficult within the country itself, meaning that people were finding it very difficult to move around, and also migratory movements for people coming in abroad. A lot of Spaniards actually did leave Spain to go into exile, and they also left Spain to try and find better opportunities, economic opportunities abroad. Other things that the dictatorship brought, which I think were very significant, for example, censorship. And it was quite interesting I only found out recently that in fact, for example, there was obviously a lot of censorship, particularly in the fields of literature, music. Many musicians had to leave; they weren't able to compose or to sing. You know, they were censored. Their lyrics were censored in Spain, and film. And in fact, from 1941, dubbing was mandatory. Films had to be dubbed. And this actually has had quite interesting consequences, because one of the features of Spain is that many Spanish people aren't that, they find English a difficult language to speak. And there is this theory that, you know, if they'd been able to watch films, subtitled films as children, as opposed to dubbed films, this might not have been the case. But anyhow, so dictatorship meant stagnation, economic stagnation, difficult communications, censorship. And this only finished in 1975, which isn't actually really that long ago. Fortunately, the country moved into had a very peaceful transition into democracy at the time. The military dictator Franco died, and it became a constitutional monarchy. And that date was absolutely crucial in the history of modern Spain. So as from 1975, the country changed completely. A new Spanish constitution was agreed in a referendum that took place over the whole country. A new Spanish constitution was agreed in 1978, which really set out people's rights. And as from there, in 1982, Spain joined NATO, and in 1986, Spain joined the European Union. So it's really from that time, from the time of Franco's death, obviously, that the country began to pick up and to put itself in the same sort of situation, on the same level as other countries in Europe. The constitution was actually also very important, because one of the other things that it allowed was for nationalities and regions to become autonomous governments, which is something you saw on the first slide. This is very, very important to understand the way Spain is today. Spain is now divided into these 19 autonomies, which have their own administrative organizations, their own parliaments, their own governments, and their own budgets. So the central government actually sends budgets out to these different autonomies. So it means that, you know, that the characteristics of each of these autonomies is very individual as well. It obviously gives the country great richness, although to a certain degree also sort of extra bureaucratic issues to deal with. And this also at the same time, 5 other languages were recognized as co-official languages of the country. So Spain is really, really diverse. Apart from Castilian, Spanish, there's Catalan, there's Galician, you know, and it's incredibly very, very, very diverse culture and language all over the country. So to carry on, so as from the 1975, when democracy was installed, there was a huge boom years that took place during the 1980s, when it was a huge economic growth. People were investing in the country. Things were really looking up for the country. And I think that time really peaked probably in 1992, which was a really important year for Spain. It was the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. And it was the year that the Olympics took place in Barcelona. And that was an incredibly interesting example of how a sports and cultural event really changed the city, apart from the investment that took place in the infrastructure and so on. It really put Barcelona on the map, I think on the world map. And it was also, funnily enough, well, curiously enough, it was the first time that the opening event of the Olympic Games was actually directed by, in this case, it was directed by a theatre company, a Barcelona theatre company called La Fura dels Baus. And I think that particular Olympic Games, that particular opening really paved the way for a new way of doing Olympic opening ceremonies. So 1992 was really characterized by the Olympics in Barcelona, also the Expo in Seville, which was an interesting comparison to Barcelona, because whereas in Barcelona there was this huge investment made in the city, and it really put the city on the world map. In Sevilla, there was also a huge investment made in creating new cultural venues for the Expo, although many of them unfortunately have now gone into disuse. So it was an interesting contrast to see the way two different cities were able to take advantage, how well they were able to take advantage of those cultural events that took place in a specific time. So as from 1992 and until the present day, Spain has suffered. We suffered a big economic crisis in 1995, and then at the same time as the rest of the world in 2008. The whole kind of financial crisis of 2008 in Spain was particularly severe because there was also a huge bubble. There was a real estate bubble that burst that year. So it really plunged the country into great economic, a huge economic crisis. In fact, this also led up to you may have heard of the 15th of May movement, which was which is basically the beginning of the Occupy movement, which was that whole movement against the austerity cuts and so on, which began in Spain in 2011. And today, where we are now, obviously Spain, as the same as all other countries all over the world, has suffered really heavily the crisis caused by the pandemic. Unemployment currently is at 13%, and all that's up to 30% among people under the age of 26. And although in fact unemployment does seem to be going down, hopefully because we've just had some changes to our labor laws, it's still obviously incredibly high. Politically, right now, the country is governed by a multi-party. Well, the governing party is the Socialists, so it's a left-wing centre party. And for the first time, we do have a multi-party government. So there's a lot of negotiation having to be going on all the time to get legislation through. And again, in the same way, I think, as in other countries in Europe, what we have seen in the last particularly the last 3 or 4 years, has been the rise of the far right, which is quite obviously very, very concerning. And in fact, there were elections just recently in one of the regions of Spain, and the right-wing party Vox managed actually got 17% of the votes. So this is something that I think we're all incredibly concerned about. So just to have a very quick look before we go into the cultural side of the overlook of Spain, just to talk about just very, very quickly relevant legislation. Fortunately, we can say that we have, in terms of LGBTQ equality, Spain passed in 2005 the equal marriage law, allowing marriage between everybody, and also the 2008 gender identity law, which allows legal change of names and sex in documentation. So in that sense, actually, Spain, having been a very religious country during the dictatorship, has actually, has been one of the leading countries in LGBT legislation since then. Thank you for changing the slide, Ludovic. So to go on to a cultural snapshot of Spain, I think one of the important things let me just check. Yeah. So the cultural industry employs just over 700,000 people, which is 3.5% of the total workforce. So it's significant, although it could be better, and it represents about 2.4% of the GDP. Cultural organizations are mainly placed in the major cities of the country. I think that all goes back to as well what I mentioned earlier about the fact that there has been an exodus from the rural areas into the cities. So cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia have really enjoyed, have really built up their cultural infrastructures since the 1980s, with the boom years after the beginning of democracy in Spain. So many of these cities have, they've got amazing auditoriums, performance spaces. Just for example, before the 1980s, there were 15 symphony orchestras in Spain, and from the 1980s to the 2000s, another 15 were created. Yeah, I'll try and summarize what I've got, the rest of what I've got to say. So there's been a lot of investment in cultural infrastructure. And then to go on to funding, just to give you a very, very brief overview of how funding works. The Ministry of Culture obviously funds a great deal of cultural projects, but most funds have been transferred to the autonomies, the autonomous governments, and they're the ones that are actually, they're responsible for funding their own performance spaces, their own companies or theatre companies or orchestras. So the funding is very distributed. Having said that, the government, just so that you know, that the government announced that its budget for this year, for 2022, is going up by 38%. This is also, I think, including the European funds, you know, for the recovery from COVID. So as I say, but the funding is very, very distributed among the regions and among the municipalities. So this actually often leads to duplication. You might find that in one city there's a symphony orchestra run by the local government and another symphony orchestra run by the council. But this is, you know, one of the consequences of having a country that's almost a federal state. And if you like, we can go on to the last slide. So just a few stats and figures about the relationship between UK and Spain, which has always been very strong. In our work at the British Council, we find that when we're talking to partners here in Spain, there's a long tradition of collaboration with UK partners, and I think that's also, there's a return there as well. So as you can see, 366,000 British people live in Spain, whereas 246,000 Spanish citizens live in the UK. And so UK is for example, is the lead country for Spanish importation of books and magazines. So British literature and British magazines in general are the top foreign literature magazines consumed by the Spanish public. And just a few more stats before I finish. We're currently finishing a survey that we've carried out about the state of culture in Spain, and we asked our Spanish partners in the survey that we sent out a few things related to their relationship. This was Spanish venues and artistic organizations, a few things related to their relationship with the British. And so one of the questions we asked was, post-COVID, post-Brexit, would they like to continue, were there plans to continue collaborating with British artists in the future? 97% replied that they would definitely want to do that, although half of those also mentioned Brexit as an issue that needs to be got, and Brexit from the point of view of mobility and visas is one of the issues that we need to get over in order for that to happen. And we also asked people to talk about their perception of British creativity, and 40% of them said that they believed that British creativity was absolutely outstanding thanks to its innovation and its excellence. And they're all, you know, there was this basically a majority want to continue collaborating and working in partnerships with British artists and British organizations in the future. So that certainly will continue.
Thank you, Cristina.
I'll hand over to you. Sorry about taking up too much time.
No, don't worry, because actually there's quite a lot to say about Spain, as you can see. I will focus right now in the next 5 minutes about the trends and actually about the post-COVID and the post-pandemic recovery from the arts sector. So just to understand clearly where the fundings and where the energy of the arts management has been going along for the past 40 years, just to structure these trends in two parts. The first one would be from the 18th until the start of this new century. So with the decentralization mentioned by Cristina before, with this rise and this ambition for political policymakers, but also arts manager and organization to position Spain in the international map, cultural map, and also to invite the world to come back to Spain. So that's why they've been creating and the major festival, especially in performing arts, but also in visual arts, have been created at that period in order to offer display display and showcase of international production in Spain, but also to offer this opportunity to get bigger awareness about what's going on in the rest of Europe. Second part was really to reinforce as well the and diversify from certain point the attractiveness for tourism. So it was a strong political statement with the creation of these flagship venues such as the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, but also lots of venues created around visual arts, mainly in the different autonomous regions. I have to say that these 10 years were a fierce competition between autonomous government in order to bring the light on their government and to attract more attention from the medias, but also from tourism. There are two examples that were very successful in all this competition. That was Bilbao with the Guggenheim Museum as a flagship venue, and the model of Malaga in Andalusia. Both cities were driven by a very constant effort by all political parties, from the regional government to the city council to the province to the country, to stabilize and to provide a unique message around the power of transformation of culture. In the case of Bilbao, it was towards entrepreneurial measures and entrepreneurial projects. And in the case of Malaga, gathering big names such as Museum Pompidou, the Picasso Museum, etc., was to attract a bigger number of tourism. The second part of this trend will be since the beginning of the 21st century and the rise of banking foundations. So immediately after the 2002, great banks and saving banks have been creating and investing quite a number of their benefit, amounts of their benefit in social works, and especially in the arts, such as Caixa Forum, with venues across the country, Casa Encendida in Madrid, Fundación Santander, BBVA on Mafre. Just to give you an example, the amount of investment of this banking foundation was 2,100 million euros in 2008. It's enormous. It's more. It's almost double as the budget invested by the Ministry of Culture at the same period of time. And just finishing on recent years, since the 2020s, we've noticed a certain internationalization of creative industries. Right now, festivals and big promoters such as Primavera Sound Festival, Sonar Festival, they may also linked it to the music, but also in visual arts such as Arco, Art Fair, or Concentrico in design, has been creating a franchise model and expanding their know-how on organizing festivals towards all the countries. So in the case of Primavera Sound is mainly Primavera Sound and BIME is mainly towards the Americas. Sonar Festival, Arco and Concentrico have been starting to implement and to create their own franchise in Portugal, for example. The main challenge for these trends is basically around the price or the autonomized sector for cultural management, the lack of sector awareness. So recently there were an intention to create or to emulate at least an organization such as UK Music to gain force towards negotiations with the government. Unfortunately, the structure doesn't have any autonomies. Neither on the financial point, neither on the administrative one. So actually all the efforts for now is quite weak in terms of influence. And just to finish and coming back to the state of culture we're just publishing right now, to give you an overview about our learnings about COVID and how arts management and organization are reacting after this pandemic. Very interesting data about the fact that arts venue have noticed a decrease in their audience after the pandemic. We've all lived a sort of bubble just immediately after the pandemic, with all concerts, exhibition and performances totally sold out. But since October 2021, we're not seeing a slight decrease in terms of audience because of the rise of the offer. So the offer is so abundant right now that actually there's no enough audience for everyone. The top two priorities for arts organization as a consequence is to recover their level of audience and also to attract new audiences. And in terms of the digital revolution, actually this digital revolution is not that clear in Spain, because for more than 50% their digital activity actually is the same as before the pandemic. So we haven't noticed a real shift in terms of creating hybrid formats or to think in terms of digital production. The international programming is still more or less the same as before the pandemic, especially based on showcasing and providing spaces for foreign production to be presented. And a last very interesting point, arts managers are considering that facility officers such as health and safety or also marketing and communication will be the most demanded profiles in the future.
And that's it really. Thank you so much to Ludovic, Georgia, Cristina for your participation today. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
And hopefully you will have a nice rest of the week.